Thank you for that kind introduction. For the next 20 minutes, we are going to shine some limelight on mother tongues and the importance of mother tongues in a very diverse country like India, where we have several languages and a flourishing tradition of literature. So for me, why mother tongue? We are all conversing in English these days. It's become a global language. Our social media, we are more comfortable using it in English. Most of us are educated in English medium. So why mother tongue? And when I ask this question to myself, I feel that languages are repositories of culture. Language is just not a medium of conversation between two people. Of course it is. It's a very important function of a language. But languages also include literature, the cultural tradition of a place, the performing arts, the stories, the songs, the oral tradition, including, some of the names and words that are associated with particular professions. For instance, some of the art forms or forms of literature genres are particular to that region. If I have to talk about Maharashtra, there are folk arts or folk performances like Vasudev, Potraj, Vagyamuri. A lot of these are cultural traditions in Maharashtra which are very difficult to translate conceptually, and also the language that accompanies them. There have been genres of literature like Abhang, Bakhar, Ovi, Lavani, Povada, Sangeet Natak, which emerged in Maharashtra, and Marathi has been very much their language. It's also reflective, a language is also reflective of way of life of a particular region. For instance, words like Nangarni, Malni, Perni, Ufanni that are associated with farming. And we have some of the outstanding literary people. For instance, Bahinabai, who was herself a farmer. She was illiterate, but she composed some of the most profound poetry in Marathi. Bahinabai says, I'll just quote a small couplet from her poetry. धरत्रीच्या कुशीमधी बिय बियाणं निजलं. धरत्रीच्या कुशीमधी बिय बियाणं निजलं, वरे पसरली माटी जशी शाल पांघरली. What she says is, she has just sowed seeds in her farm and she has put a layer of soil on them, and she compares it as if, children, babies are sleeping, and the soil is a kind of a shawl or a covering over them. Very lovingly and with great affection she has spread that soil. And this is very intrinsic to the language, to the way of life that is very, very common in Maharashtra, especially the rural regions. Similarly, if we come to the modern era, the Dalit literature emerged from Maharashtra, and some of the very profound experiences which are very unique to certain classes, when they were expressed in poetry, we have some of the outstanding poets that emerged from Maharashtra. I quote Namdev Dhasal, one of the most important Dalit poets. बोलून चालून ते सामंतशहा, त्यांनी तिजोरीत लॉक केलेला प्रकाश, लादलेल्या पडीबाज आयुष्यात फुटपाथ देखील आपला नाही. What he means is, they are the ruling classes and they have locked light in their lockers. And the life of deprivation forced upon them is so bad that even the footpath, we don't even own the footpath on which we live. So these kind of expressions are part of the identity of a people speaking a particular kind of language. And that's why I feel that language, our mother tongues, all the variety of languages that my mother tongue is Marathi, so I gave you examples from Marathi. But all the languages in India, I think, perform the same function of representing a particular way of life, a particular culture, a particular tradition from those regions. Now let me ask Saaz, about what has been her experience of Sindhi language.
So I will speak about mother tongue first. And I interviewed somebody, a young person, a short while ago, a young man who lives in the US. And he grew up in Calcutta and Bombay. That's what they were when he was growing up. And he comes from a very affluent and educated family of Sindh. So when he was in the US, he went as a teenager. And obviously there were all kinds of difficulties in settling down. And what he told me was that one of the things which he did not expect was that he was mocked for the way he spoke English. And it wasn't just the accent that he used, it was also, kind of an ungrammatical and unidiomatic English. It wasn't pidgin because he'd been to the best schools in Calcutta and Bombay, but it was different. And I'm starting with that because that is the state of the Sindhi language in India today. Sindh, as you may know, was in 1947, Sindh was given intact to Pakistan, and it was assumed that the minorities would, the non-Muslims would continue to live there because they'd been a peaceful minority for centuries. But of course, that's not how it happened. They were ejected. They were scattered all over the world. They were all over the world, not just, they already had outposts in various parts of the world, a story which I will tell you a little later. But what happened is that when they landed up in new places, and they had no access to the home country, there was no place they had access to where their language was spoken on the street. So they chose to stop speaking to their children in their mother tongue, and they started using local languages to give their children a better chance in the new life that they had that had suddenly been thrust upon them. Now, many years have passed since then. Many of the people I have interviewed have regretted this. I wish that I'd spoken to my children, including my mom, who was Sindhi. I wish that I'd spoken to my children in Sindhi, and the children will say, oh, I wish I'd learned when I had the chance. And the funniest one is that when they spoke to each other in Sindhi, we knew that they were they were saying something that they didn't want us to understand. I mean, there's a poignancy in that. If someone asks me about my mother tongue, I always tell the story of Khushiram Kundanani, who was a professor in National College, Hyderabad, Sindh. And soon after partition, there was a lot of breakdown of, the law and order. The schools and colleges were closed, and that continued even after partition. And finally, when things started getting back together, he realized that the college is not going to start. And he decided, now I'm going to carry the college with me to Bombay. So he actually packed some books and some laboratory equipment, and he arrived in Bombay, and he was staying as a refugee. And I heard this story from somebody who was a child in the house at that time. He was writing postcards to his colleagues and promising them that whatever they were doing, they had to keep doing it, but they need to, he was going to build the college again, and he did. So this is a story of how the Sindhis rehabilitated themselves with bravery and determination, facing all kinds of rejection and humiliation. They just kept going. Why I'm telling you this story is because national colleges where my parents met, and they did not know each other's languages. My mother's language was Sindhi. My father's language was Konkani. I grew up in Tamil Nadu. My third language in school was Tamil. And I cannot speak any of those languages. I don't regret it at all, honestly. I read this recently. It's a quote by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. If you know all the languages of the world but not your mother tongue, that is enslavement. If you know your mother tongue and other languages, that is empowerment. So for me...
That's very profound.
Well, yeah. When I read it, I was surprised at how brazenly I have faced my situation. Some people might consider it a disability, but for me, I know how to cope with it. I'm okay with English.
I think that the kind of work that you have done for language is really important.
Thank you, Archana. I appreciate that very much.
In the interest of time, let's
let's
just move on to the
Yeah.
next. So if I have to talk about the Marathi diaspora, I call diaspora of all the people who are Marathi speaking or of Maharashtrian origin, but who live outside Maharashtra as well as who live outside the country. And the interesting thing about it is that these Marathi diasporas have kept in touch with each other because of three things. I think the first is the love for theatre. If you see any 10 Maharashtrians getting together anywhere, they would want to stage a play once a year at least. The second is the Ganesh Utsav. So this 10-day Ganesh festival that you live in Mumbai, so you would have witnessed it. And the tradition is that the 10-day Ganesh festival is accompanied by a lot of cultural activities. There are poetry recitations, there are plays that are staged, there are film screenings, there are talks, oratory. All this brings together, and then Marathi language gives them a platform to do that. And the third thing is, I think, the tradition of having special issues in Diwali of the magazines. So Maharashtra has a rich tradition of magazines. Some of them are also literary magazines, but there are other magazines as well. And all these magazines have come out with special editions in Diwali. Now, with technology, what has happened is the diaspora has carried these traditions outside of Maharashtra, and that's where they come during this Ganesh Utsav, or they form theatre groups, or they bring out these editions, special issues, and they write, and then they use the language. That's what prompts them to use the language. What is, if I may ask you, what is the state of Sindhi literature today?
So Sindhi actually has a very strong literature, poetry, philosophy. The best known voice is Shah Abdul Latif, who influenced the language a lot. It wasn't just the intellectuals, but the common people also who understand his work, and the values and the philosophy comes through in the language. But if you look at closer to the present day, if you look at the 1940s, there was a huge population of intellectuals in Sindh, writers and poets. Many of them were involved in the freedom movement. They were, they were creating awareness about the need for British rule. Many of them passed along, during the Quit India movement, long periods in jail. After partition, all that got over, and in 1950, when the Constitution was brought out, Sindhi was not it was not a national language. It was not an Indian language, which was a huge trauma for the community because they'd lost everything, and now their language was taken away. It was a terrible time. There was this young lawyer at that time coming up, who would soon be, I'd one day be the most famous lawyer in India, Ram Jethmalani. He fought the case. And in the 1967, the 8th schedule was published with Sindhi. But that's 20 years, and the language languished, and, there wasn't much left. So today, yes, there is interest. The language is being taught. There's a lot of support from the government, but there's another very big thing that came in the way, which is that after partition, people felt that we should not use the old script. We can have Devanagari, which may have been the original script in Sindhi, and that created a big divide between this already fractured community. And, so now today you can study in Devanagari, but if you have learned Sindhi in Devanagari, you don't have access to the classical texts because those are still in the ancient script. It's not an ancient script, it was...
medieval script.
No, it isn't even medieval. It's recent. It's in British times, this script with 52 alphabets. It was, designed by the Sindhis. And in fact, there was a Maharashtrian also on that panel, N.J. Vaidya. So that script, people think it's too difficult, Nobody stops to think that, well, in Sindh, children learn that, It's not a problem at all. But today, I've had teachers telling me they get the textbooks they call it the Perso-Arabic script. It's actually the Sindhi script. We get the text in that script, and we have to transliterate it all into Devanagari. And I'm thinking to myself, why don't you just teach your children the Perso-Arabic script? But it's very complicated, and this is part of the Sindhi story.
So you're right. I mean, when the society gets fragmented, it's difficult, and especially if the script is different. I also am part of Marathi diaspora because I live in Delhi. I've always lived in Delhi. But that call of the mother tongue has always been there. I started by translating, books into Marathi from English. I translated authors who had been writing in all different Indian languages, whose short stories had been translated into either English or Hindi. I got two short story collections of All India writers. Then I translated Indira Goswami, who's a very popular Assamese writer. I translated her biography into Marathi, which was so well received because it was kind of an introduction to the Marathi readers of Assamese culture. And then I translated her novel, Chinnamasta, which is also very quintessentially an Assamese culture, and which was very, very well received in Maharashtra. And then I translated Namita Gokhale's Shakuntala. And then simultaneously I had begun writing in Marathi. My short stories were published in all these Diwali special issues that I mentioned. And my latest book is Swayamsiddha. It's a collection of 5 stories on 5 women from characters from Mahabharata who rebelled and kind of charted their own course for their life. But when I wrote my science fiction novel, I wrote it in English. And maybe the reason for that was because, it was science fiction and I read a lot of popular science books, and the story came to me in English. But you have written, about the Sindhi culture, and your book, the stories from a vanished homeland. How did it come about? Just tell us about that.
Most of my work is based on oral histories. When I started, I just interviewed my mother, and it wasn't going to be a big thing. It was just something I was doing to try and make her happy. But I realized that this is a huge story, and that's when it started. And it's still going on. In fact, every day I learn new things. Yesterday, Archana and I was talking, and she asked me, do you know Lakshman Hardwani? And I said, no. And he's a writer, he's a poet who writes in both Sindhi and Marathi, and he lives in my city, and I didn't know him. So I was like, this is the kind of thing, because of the scattering of the community. So I started with stories from a vanished homeland. When I realized that, it's such a big story, I interviewed a lot of other people, read stuff. I self-published it because I'm in a hurry to get it out on a particular date, which she had mentioned. Our ship arrived in Bombay on so-and-so day, and she was only 13, she still remembered it. So I did the book then, but it got picked up by Oxford University Press. And the next book I did was on a community called the Armils. It's this huge 700. For that, I interviewed around 200 people, solid oral histories there. Then during the lockdown, I did a book called Sindhi Tapestry, which is a collection of essays. It's an anthology from various people who wrote in about the Sindhi identity. And, people of many different ages, from different parts of the world. The newest book is called Losing Home, Finding Home, and I've written it actually it's got a lot of visuals in it. I had an artist who did them for me because there are a lot of things that we don't have photos of. So he did stuff which is historically authentic, and also the people are recognizable. It's very simply written. It kind of encapsulates what I've learned. It has real life stories, and it has all the messages that I want to pass on.
I think we have run out of time. So just to conclude, I just want to mention a YouTube channel that we had started. It's called Granthayatra. If anybody is interested in the history of or the Marathi literature, do look it up on YouTube. And thank you so much, Saaz.
Thanks,
and thank you to the audience for being here for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.